The room kept its own weather. In winter, it was a pocket of winter inside the house. The single window frosted at the edges, a thin film of chill that rode the drafts and lay over Sam's blanket like a second skin. He slept with his hand curled against his mouth, as if holding on to something I couldn't see. I counted the rise and fall of his chest the way other mothers count prayers, softly, hoping the rhythm would steady, willing breath into steadiness with my eyes. My hands were always cold, as if they had learned to be small and practical in a kitchen that offered more damp than heat. I cupped his forehead with the heel of my palm and remembered summers when the room smelled like basil and soap, and the whole house felt alive with the noise of a father who sang at the sink. Those summers felt like someone else's life now. Sam's cough had come slow and then fast. Doctor's words were wrapped in polite hesitance, and the landlord's letters arrived folded so many times the paper wore thin. Money was a seam I followed from day to day. There is a way poverty presses you into the shape of small mercies, mending a shirt twice, boiling the same kettle for guests who do not come, pretending the rent will arrive by kindness and not by banknotes. The miracle, if we must call it that, came on a Wednesday that smelled like rain and old brick. She arrived with a basket. She was small in the way that light can be small at dawn, hard to name at first, only a feeling that shifted the room's angle. Her hair was braided plain and threaded with a stray strand of silver. She moved with the economy of someone who had learned how to measure time by what needed to be kept. Clara, if we must call it that, her voice fit around the room like a scarf. She did not call herself Clara at once. Names were given in pieces here. When she said it later, Clara, it sounded like a small bell. She did not come in through the door at first. I saw her from the kitchen where I was trying not to make noise while Sam slept. She stood by the garden gate, as if waiting for permission to cross into our small, stubborn patch of green. The garden had been neglected by the previous tenant, and I had kept it more out of stubbornness than hope. A sprig of rosemary, a dubious row of marigolds, a tangle of wildflowers that would not be tamed. Clara knelt among them and touched the soil with palms that had dirt in their lines. When she looked up, I understood, without being told, that she knew that place. If you want to hear the whole story, stay with me until the end. If it moves you, consider subscribing and liking so these stories can find others who need them. She came inside before I could ask if she needed anything. She carried a small parcel wrapped in cloth and a jar that hummed faintly with the smell of something green and citrusy. She did the small things first. She boiled water and set a towel over Sam's knees while I sat on the edge of his bed and pretended to read the pages of a book I held upside down. She warmed my hands in hers and then slid something into my palm, an herb cloth, warm and damp. "For the cough," she said. "We breathe differently when the air around us is different." There was no bell of theology in her words, no talk of miracles. She spoke in trades I half understood. Teas that loosened the tight places, drafts to be blocked, sunlight measured in minutes. But she had other things as well. Tiny glass vials with corks, a thin leather pouch stitched with blue thread, and a battered wooden box that smelled faintly of resin and old paper. When she set it on the kitchen table, the wood made a sound that seemed to settle the house. Nayen, my sister, arrived that afternoon because small houses have a way of becoming full of other people's feet when they already have too few. Nayen's eyes are quick and practical. She measured Clara in 3 looks: the way she kept her shoulders loose, the way she did not speak too loudly, the way her hands closed over the herb bundle with a familiarity that did not ask permission. "Where did you learn that?" Nayen asked. Clara laughed once, a small, soundless thing. "From people who do not draw maps," she said, "from gardens and from mouths that remember." We were cautious, as you are when you are hungry for help and afraid to be fooled. The town had its stories about healers, women who took coin and left sorrow in their wake, men who promised comfort and left only obligations. People called them many things depending on which room they had lost a thing in. I watched Clara measure cups of tea, watched Sam's color shift as steam lifted into the room. There was a slow, visible easing around his shoulders as the tea cooled on his lips. For the first time in months, I slept for an hour unafraid. Clara stayed. It was both the easiest and the hardest decision. She took work in the way she knew, tending the garden, mending what I could not, sitting with Sam when his breathing made small sounds in the dark. She worked quietly, and the house slowly took on the rhythm of her hands. A towel thrown over a chair to dry, a pot left half full at the sink, a single plant moved from the porch to a windowsill that caught light. Her presence was not the arrival of brightness so much as the redistribution of light, the quiet that lets you hear a clock again. "We should ask for a little," Nyan said once, pragmatic as always. "There are those who will give when things are plainly asked for." I wanted to be proud and stubborn, but I knew the shape of our account book. There are days when pride is a heavier coat than hunger. So I accepted a few coins from a neighbor who owed me a kindness, and we paid the rent for that month. Clara refused to take money for more than a handful of small tasks, the way a person refuses a favor and then lets it sit like a coin on a table. She said she had reasons she could not explain, or reasons she kept like seeds. Clara's box stayed closed on the top shelf of the pantry for a week. Every now and then she would take it down and run her fingers over the lid as if reading the grain. She did not open it for show. She opened it when Sam slept and the house had drawn long breaths. The first time I saw the inside of the box, I remember the smell of old paper and lemon peel and something metallic and sharp. There were small envelopes tied with string, dried petals, a handful of seeds in tissue, and a thin scrap of paper on which somebody had written a single word in a hand I did not recognize. "Light," it said, and under it another word, "keeps." There were other things, a brass key without an obvious lock, a tiny vial of pale liquid that shimmered like pale honey when moved, and a worn folded note that said nothing and everything at once. Clara never explained the contents. She would only say, "Some things are safer in fragments." Lucas came one evening with a cart that creaked the way slow things do. He was not the sort of man I would, in better days, have noticed in a room full of fine clothes and loud talk. He smelled of rain and dust and the kind of steadiness that has been learned through loss. He and I had history we had not cleared away. Two people who had loved and lost, who had tried to become friends again and only sometimes succeeded. He had a scar on his knuckle from a door he couldn't quite close. He helped where he could, fixing the fence and carrying wood, and he sat with Sam and told the boy stories about the sea, even though he had only ever seen it in a picture. "She's not like the others," he said once, watching Clara kneel over the seeds. "She stitches things back together without trying to mend the tearing." There was also Rhea, sometimes Mara, depending on who was speaking, who came like a rumor. She was younger than Clara, with eyes the color of old glass. She carried a satchel of candles and a knowledge that had the restless curiosity of someone who reads the edges of maps. Rhea knew the chapel and the back road that led through the hedge in which the night dragged its feet. She moved with a grace that made people lower their voices. She had been the one to mention the chapel at the edge of town with the burned steps and the stain on the door. "It remembers what people left there," she said, and I knew she was speaking in a language the town had almost forgotten. Rumors arrived in slow, frayed threads. The cloak people, neighbors who watched less than whispered, began to gather at the edge of our lane. They did not come with banners or claims, they came as soft suspicion, as the folding up of windows and doors. A woman at the market said, "They say the healer trades favors for things she cannot replace." Another whispered that Clara had been seen arguing with a cloaked woman by the chapel, and that the cloaked woman had hands like roots. Fear does an odd arithmetic with imagination. When you have been awake for months with the sound of your child's breath on the pillow, the world rearranges itself into potential threats. I started to watch the garden gate the way a lighthouse watches the horizon. There were shadows that did not belong to the time of day. Once, in the thinning light, I saw someone move behind the chapel with a hood like a bird's beak. Their presence felt like cold iron in the back of the throat. Sam's condition edged and receded in small cycles. There would be days of color and play when he managed to sit up and draw on paper with a stub of charcoal, making clumsy suns. And then nights when his breath would come ragged and the line of his face would look too sharp under the lamp. Clara began to bring vials that smelled of earth and lemon, and each time I watched her uncork them, my hand hovered over the tiny pouch of coins as though I might pay for peace in small, precise increments. The box in the pantry began to feel less like a relic and more like a map. There were notes inside, tiny folded papers with single instructions. A light held at the heart will not be folded by shadows. Plant what wakes. Give what you cannot keep without losing yourself. I would translate them to myself at night when the house had settled and Sam breathed steadily, and I did not know whether my head was making the words up. Sometimes the notes matched a dream I'd had. Clara at a table, arranging flowers, and a shadow at the door that spoke in a voice like rain on old metal. Then the disappearance. She did not vanish with drama. One morning the kettle was not on the stove, the wooden box was closed and gone from the shelf, and Clara's bed, an old quilt folded under the sink, was empty. Sam woke coughing, and I pulled him to my chest like a shield. At first I told myself she had gone to the market. Then neighbors said that a cloaked figure had been seen in the lane, and that the figure had not moved like a person, but in a way a tide moves. Nayan said she took her things, as if that settled a debt. I knew better. Things don't often walk away. People do. I walked the garden without purpose and found a trail of small petals that led toward the hedge. They were crushed into the mud, like cheap confetti at a funeral. At the edge of the path, hung on a branch, was a scrap of cloth that matched the cloth Clara used to wrap the vials. My heart did a thing I had not allowed it to do in a long time. It crested. Rhea arrived at dusk and would not let the silence stand. She was not taken for nothing, Rhea said when she saw the scrap. Nor did she leave truly. She is in a place between. Her hands trembled like wind in reeds. There are things tied to that chapel, she said, and I felt the word like a small rope tighten around my chest. There is a room under the front where people leave what they cannot carry. It remembers names. It remembers debts. We made a plan that was little and enormous at once. Lucas would watch the lane and keep Sam safe. Naeem would stay with me and hold the kettle steady. Rhea would lead the way to the chapel because her footsteps cost less than mine. It was a strange practical superstition, but it comforted me. In the hours before we left, we packed so few things it felt indecent. A scarf, the coin I kept in my shoe for emergencies, a scrap of the quilt. I tucked the herb cloth Clara had given me into my pocket as if it might be a map. I had no right to expect miracles. I had only the right to try. The road to the chapel was a memory stitched to a boundary. The hedges leaned in, and late autumn had thinned the branches so that moonlight came through like questions. We walked in a tight line, pockets of breath puffing white. Rhea moved ahead, and the chapel silhouette grew into a thing that was at once small and monumental, the kind of building that holds the shape of people's fear. Its door was warped, and someone had scrawled a cross into the wood with a nail. There were scorch marks on the step, like places where old arguments had burnt themselves into the stone. We found signs of life and not life at once. A candle stub still standing in a puddle of wax. Footprints leading to the side of the building that dipped down toward a narrow cellar door. The cellar smelled of cold and old books. There were votive candles on a ledge, half eaten by time. On the dirt floor were smudged prints like the mouths of small animals.
There was a sound, low and like a wind trapped in a bell, coming from somewhere deep below. I should have been brave. I had rehearsed bravery in the small sick hours, holding a child and imagining the ways I could be terrible in defense of him. But when Rhea placed the ladder into the well of the cellar and began to climb down with a quiet rope, I felt something thin and honest settle over me. "If you go, take," she said, and pressed a small folded scrap of paper into my hand. On it, in hurried strokes, were the words, "Light is not only what you carry, it is what you give." The ladder creaked under Rhea's weight. Lucas took the line and held it like a prayer. I clutched the herb cloth as if it were a talisman. And in that grip there was an equation of fear. Clara's life versus Sam's breath. I thought, briefly, of the brass key in Clara's box. I thought, briefly, of the small vial of pale liquid that shimmered like honey. And then I thought, longer and louder, of Sam's laugh as he tried to make a paper boat last summer, and the way his hair had fallen into his eyes, like a child who does not yet know how to keep storms at bay.
They coil around things people cannot let go of. They are not all of one kind. Some are made of grief. Others are made of anger. They feed on what you believe you have to keep. I understood then what the cloaked people had been at the edge of town. Not a gang or a council, but a congregation of sorrow made physical. They were not necessarily cruel in the way we think of cruelty. Their gesture was the gesture of people who had decided their loss could be sustained by collecting more loss. They were keepers of small, private despairs. When I finally descended into the cellar, the air closed around me like a hand. The space was low and round, the stones of the walls sweating years. There were icons nailed up with faces rubbed smooth. And, in the center of the room, a circle of people in cloaks whose hoods were pulled down. Clara sat among them like a candle unlit, her wrists bound with a cord that glowed faintly in the dark. Her eyes were open, and when she saw me, she offered a smile so small it was almost obscene in that place. "Why?" I asked, and the question had the weight of a blade. "Why would you let them take you?" Clara's voice was calm, soft as linen. "They came for what I keep," she said, "and they cannot stand light that refuses to be caged." The cloaked woman who led them stepped forward. She wore a veil that hid most of her face. Her hands were bare and long, like roots. Her voice moved like moving water. "We took what was needed," she said. "We draw the debts to themselves. If people will not give up their pain, we will take it in their stead. It is better to hold it than to watch it drown someone." Something in that sentence was slippery with a logic that could kill. It was not a rant. It was an argument, made precise and cold. I felt the room narrow around my ribs. "She healed my son," I said. The words came out as accusation and plea both. "You do not understand," the cloaked woman said. "There is always a cost." The tendrils, if that is what they were, coiled at the edges of the circle like smoke caught on a nail. They were not wholly dark. They had a color like ash and old iron, and sometimes the gleam of skin. Their motion was patient. They whispered to one another in sounds that were like memory. Clara moved when I stood. Her wrists came free as if someone had cut the cord, though I had not felt a blade. She rose and stepped between me and the circle, and there was a moment in which her face lit as if a candle had finally been lit inside her chest. "You do not have to take this alone," she said. "Give it back. Share it. Let it be a thing that is no one's to keep." The cloaked woman laughed then, a sound like a drawer closing. "You cannot simply hand pain back like a coin," she said. "We have rules. You cannot return what you never owned." Clara lifted her hands, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw a change, as if dust had been wiped away. She reached into her skin like a seamstress into a pocket and drew out a small necklace.
a scrap of metal with an image of a sun. The light from it was not strong, but it was steady as breath. She pressed it to her chest, and the sound in the cellar shifted, as if a bell had been tilted. "We will not give it away," she said. "We will share it. You cannot take all that is human and label it yours." One of the cloaked figures moved closer, and the tendril at the tip of her sleeve lengthened like a lover's finger. It curled toward Clara and then recoiled as if stung. The woman hissed. "Then choose," she said. "Choose whose grief will be kept and whose will be freed." The astronomical simplicity of the demand stunned me. Choose between hurt and survival, between a life at home and a stranger's freedom, between binding and releasing. In the world of bills and appointments, such choices are rarely offered with such bluntness. They arrive in small increments. Skip a meal, sell a ring, borrow and forget. Here, the choice was ceremonial and final. "Take me," Clara said quietly. "Take me and my keeping. She needs her son." The word struck me like a bell. I saw then the cost that had been in Clara's hands from the beginning. It had not been a trade, it had been a practice, to collect what others could not hold and carry it like a pail of water. I wanted to tear the cloaks from the people who sat around the circle, to pull the tendrils from their hands, but the room made the idea of violence stupid and thin. Violence in that cellar would be a child's answer to an adult problem. I thought of Lucas sitting with Sam, of Nyan by the door, of a boy's small hands folded like a promise. I thought of the brass key in Clara's box. What lock did it open? I thought of the vial that shimmered like honey. My heart, which had been lately made of small coin and careful breaths, expanded to a size that hurt. Love, I think, is sometimes that, an ache that informs every limb. "Then we choose together," I said, "not you alone." Clara turned to me, and in the small light of that cell, she looked like something made of thread and willingness. Her eyes went to mine, and I saw an answer older than both of us. Love, shared, becomes unassailable. The cloaked woman tightened. Around her, the tendrils reached like questions. "You cannot return what is already given," she said. "Giving binds." "Binding can be with hands or with hearts," Clara replied. "We will bind it with light." Light is a slippery word in a cellar. It is not bright. It is the kind of warmth that threads into a wound. Clara took the brass key from her pocket and turned it into the air. The key shivered, and a thin strand of light leapt from its tooth and braided itself with the sun piece on her necklace. It made a sound like a twig snapping in the distance. The room inhaled.
Everything in me said to run, with Sam, with the small coin we had left. But another part of me settled into the steadiness of a thing that knows what it has to do. There was no sermon in that part, only a calculation. What cost could I live with? What cost could I not? "Share, then," the cloaked woman said, and the voice had the tiredness of someone who had argued with a child and lost patience. "Share the keeping. But know this, what you give will change you. Nothing returns unchanged." It was an honest warning. In the world we live, prices pay in ways that the books do not show. Clara smiled then, not with triumph, but with the weight of someone who had made a promise and kept it for reasons the rest of us would call foolish. She reached into the center of the circle, and with steady hands she unwrapped a thin cloth. Inside lay a small votive, carved from wax the color of milk. She did not offer it as a ransom. She set it on the ground and pressed her palm over it. Lucas's voice, low and certain at the edge of the cellar, drew my attention. He held the rope like a lifeline. "If this is a trade, then we are all in," he said. He climbed down with the calm of someone who knows how to enter a dangerous place and remain himself. When he reached us, he did not strike the cloaked people.
He stood beside Clara and took Sam's fate into his look. Nyan stayed by the ladder to keep watch. "If this goes wrong," she said to me, her jaw steady, "we run with what we have, but we do not leave." Clara began to sing. It was the strangest thing. Her voice had no arrogance, only the steady cadence of someone telling truth in a language that might be older than the bricks around us. Her words were not words I understood, not fully, but the sound threaded something into the air. The tendrils hesitated. The cloaked woman watched, and in her watch I saw the softening of an angle. The candle between Clara's palms burned with a flame that did not consume wax so much as illuminate it. It threw shadows that danced along the stones and made patterns of small forgivenesses. "Share," Clara said again, and this time there was an instruction in it. "Let what you keep be held by many hands. Let grief be divided until none of us can carry it alone." One by one, those in the circle laid their hands upon the votive. The tendrils withdrew, not with surrender, but with the decision of something that had found a different hunger. It was not a battle so much as a redirection. Where before the cellar was a thing of hoarded sorrow, it became a place where sorrow was traded and shared and folded thin. When the last cloaked person rose, the hood slipped, and under it was a face that looked like a map of small wars. The woman who had been the leader looked at Clara with something close to wonder. She reached toward the votive and did not snatch it. She touched it with a fingertip and then, as if realizing what she had done, drew back. "We will watch," she said, "but we will not keep."
Clara's wrists were free. The votive in her palm burned low and warm. She looked at me and then at Sam, who had been carried in Lucas's arms to our house by the time we emerged from the chapel. In the lane, the night air was an honest cold, and Sam slept like a child who had been promised sleep and accepted it. He did not know what had been traded for his breath. He did not yet have to. We walked home with the votive wrapped in a piece of cloth. It did not need to smell like coin or like victory. It smelled like the porch at dawn, watered soil, and the small, clean scent of things that have been tended. Clara carried the box. She had retaken it from where she had left it and now kept it close as if it were a friend who had been missing. There were wounds that would not vanish. There are debts that do not dissolve with a single night. But the house felt different, not by the ledger or the coin, but by the fact of other hands in the work. Lucas mended the worst of the fence. Nyan made soup that tasted like the sort of courage that comes in a bowl. Rhea visited and left candles at the windows. Clara sat by Sam's bed and braided his hair with the kind of tenderness that is practice more than talent. In the days that followed, small miracles threaded themselves through the ordinary. Sam's cough softened into a rhythm that was easier to breathe around. The landlord, who once flushed with impatience when bills were late, found a small letter of forgiveness tucked in a returned envelope. A neighbor's anonymous help. The garden grew a little braver, sending up more wildflowers than it had the year before, as if the earth, too, had decided to keep something instead of hoarding it. Clara did not claim a title. She did not speak of herself as a healer or a keeper. She came and went in ways that made me think she belonged to the road as much as to our small kitchen. She said that her box was full of things people had placed there to remember. Seeds of forgiveness, scraps of prayers, a key that opens more than one door. Once, when Sam laughed aloud at a story Lucas told about a gull that stole a sandwich, Clara's eyes filled, and she touched my hand with a gentleness that sounded like thanks. We learned, slowly, how to let others keep the small costs. We learned that sharing does not make the sorrow lighter by arithmetic, but by company. The same stone carried by 10 hands is not lighter, but it is less lonely. I learned, too, that there are sacrifices that heal and sacrifices that wound. Clara's sacrifice was not a vanishing, but a sharing. Then there was the night the cloaked woman returned, but this time she stood at the edge of the garden without the habit of secrecy. She came without tendrils.
Her veil was down, and in her face I read a tired humility. "We have kept too much," she said. "We are learning not to. It is harder than we thought." Clara met her at the gate, and for a moment the two women stood like two kinds of weather.
They spoke softly then, in a language that was more like arranging than arguing. I heard the cloaked woman say, "There are things I held to stop others from falling, but in holding I made them fall in other ways." "Then hold my hand instead," Clara answered. "Hold our hands." I think that was the turning point. Not the chapel, not the votive burned in a cellar, but the way two people who knew how to keep things finally decided to clasp hands and make a circle of warmth. It was small. It was human. It changed the town the way a well-timed rain changes a field. Sam returned to making paper boats. He still had bad days, nights that required the tea and the herbs and the watchful rotation of Lucas, of Nain, and of me. But they were fewer. He grew used to the idea that help might arrive in small parcels wrapped in cloth, and he began to share his own little treasures with Clara. A paper bird, a pebble that he insisted had a face. Clara kept them like the rest of us keep promises. One morning, when the frost had finally surrendered to a shy sun, I dug at the garden and found a seed that was not from the soil I had planted. It was tiny and black and knew how to become a bloom. I planted it by the window where Sam could watch it grow. It unfurled like a small white flag against the dull weather of our days. Clara left eventually. Her goodbyes were simple and without drama. She wrapped her box and left it on the kitchen table as if ensuring that it would be there when we looked for it. She kissed Sam's forehead and told him to guard his laugh. "It keeps more than you think," she said. She walked away down the lane with a kind of slow, obedient step. When we watched from the porch, Sam's small hand clutched the paper bird he had given her. "She'll be back," he said. He said this without ceremony, as if he expected the world to give him such gifts because that is what the world does when it is being taught well. I have kept Clara's box on a shelf. Sometimes I open it and let the scent of old paper and resin and lemon wash over me. There are new scraps of paper inside now, notes I wrote and left, prayers folded into rough shapes, a small list of things we cannot forget, laughter, the memory of a hand that did not let go, the sound of a child breathing in his sleep. We have learned to share our burdens with the town, but perhaps more importantly, we have learned to accept help without the sharp edge of shame. There is forgiveness, not as an abstraction, but as practical kindness. A neighbor bringing bread, Lucas taking the long route home so the lane is not lonely, Nain calling to remind me to sleep. The cloaked woman sometimes leaves a small bundle on our doorstep, an apology made of cloth and a scrap of paper with a single word, "Forgive." It is not a magic erasure, but it is a beginning. If this story found you and moved something in you, please consider subscribing and liking so more stories like this can be shared. It helps this little narrative keep going to others who might need it. When dawn comes now, it does not spill as it once did, sudden and smug. It arrives tentative and coy, and in its light the garden looks ordinary and miraculous at once. Sam and I sit at the window and watch the seed we planted push itself into a bloom. We have learned that hope is not an immense thing. It lives in small vessels, a votive burned in the dark, a hand taken from the edge of a cellar, a box of scraps kept safe on a shelf. I do not know where Clara will go next. I only know where she has been, inside our house, inside the hollow of my fear, inside the small map of our better days, and what she left behind. A practice of sharing, a lesson that love can be the currency that buys survival in small towns and cold rooms. Once, when Sam sneezed and laughed at the same time, Clara smiled and told him, "Keep your laughter, it is the best remedy." He keeps it still. There are nights when I wake and listen for something, a footstep at the gate, a voice in the lane,
the soft scrape of a box being set down. Sometimes I think I hear Clara's song on the wind, and I understand that she was not only my son's hope in a moment of desperation, she was the teaching of a life, that hands joined can be a way to carry what we cannot carry alone. The garden blooms accordingly. We do not pretend the world is without shadows anymore. They come and they twist, and sometimes they find a place in the city of our lives. But we have learned to hold a light that can be passed hand to hand, and so we pass it. The bloom kept its white face turned toward the window, as if it had learned something about waiting. It did not demand sunlight. It accepted what came and changed it into something small and true. Sam called it the promise flower, and named each petal when they fell, as if there were a way to make promises last by confessing them aloud. He would press his small palm to the glass and talk to it in a language of curiosity and errands. What he had in his pockets, what he had given away, who had laughed that morning. Sometimes he sang to it, the tune thin and unsure, and the house answered with the sigh of the kettle and the slow creak of the floorboards. There were mornings when the old habits of fear returned like weather, sudden and dense, and I would find Sam curled on the rug, paper bird clutched to his chest, cheeks wet from a dream he could not name. Lucas would come in with his quiet boots and set down a steaming mug. Nain would offer an extra blanket, and once a hand-painted wooden soldier, whose joints were loose but whose face remained sternly kind. These small offerings were the town's currency now, not grand rescues, but practical stitches. We learned to distribute those stitches. The cloaked woman kept to her pattern, her bundles, her single-word notes.
They began to arrive at odd hours, left beneath the eaves or tucked into the hollow of a stone by the gate, so that you had to kneel and touch the cold to find them. Nayan took to leaving a saucer of tea on the step for whoever came at dawn. Lucas swept the lane when the wind had been cruel. The neighbor who kept bees brought honey in jars wrapped with scraps of cloth and tied with twine. She told me once that bees remember which flowers were good to them. I thought about that when Sam ran his fingers along the stem of the promise flower and asked if it would remember him when he was gone. "Flowers don't go," he said, solemn as a judge. "They stay." "Some do," I answered, because there was no use yet in arguing with him about the parts of the world that move on. He believed in things staying. It steadied him, and in the steadiness, it steadied me. One afternoon, after a week of thrifted sunshine, a letter arrived. It was the sort of surprise that stilled the house. No stamp, no neat envelope, just paper folded twice and thinner than a child's hand. Inside was only a short sentence in a looping script I did not know at first. "For the boy who keeps laughter." There was a small sketch beneath it, a bird in flight, and a line that curved like a smile. The paper carried the faint trace of lemon oil and resin. Sam read it 3 times, each time as if testing the words for weight. He showed it to Lucas, who frowned like someone taking a problem apart. Nayan tasted the air around it, as if letters might hold a scent that would reveal a face. I thought of Clara before I could stop myself, how she had wrapped her box and gone with the plainness of someone undertaking a necessary journey. The note might be hers. It might be Truth's cousin, something only like it. We set a small place at the table and ate bread and cheese in the kind of silence that was not vacant, but listening. Sam sat upright and propped his paper bird on the rim of his bowl, as if the bird needed to be present for the reading of the letter. He insisted that the bird be given a new name, Messenger. It suited him, because in his mind, the world was full of people who meant small mercies by accident or design. Days folded into one another with the same soft rhythm. I planted thyme along the windowsill and learned to smoke out the damp from the corners of the house. Lucas took to carving small toys from bits of leftover wood and would leave them on doorsteps of those neighbors who had once done him favors in the storms of his youth. He began to talk more,
telling soft, careful stories about his father, about how hands teach hands to keep working, even when the heart wants to stop. His voice had a new patience in it. The town, which had always been a cluster of private griefs and borrowed cheerfulness, grew used to our open-armedness. It is surprising how quickly people accept an invitation to be needed. Days folded into one another with the same soft rhythm. I planted thyme along the windowsill and learned to smoke out the damp from the corners of the house. Lucas took to carving small toys from bits of leftover wood and would leave them on doorsteps of those neighbors who had once done him favors in the storms of his youth. He began to talk more, telling soft, careful stories about his father, about how hands teach hands to keep working even when the heart wants to stop. His voice had a new patience in it. The town, which had always been a cluster of private griefs and borrowed cheerfulness, grew used to our open-armedness. It is surprising how quickly people accept an invitation to be needed.
The workshop by the square, run by a woman with 3 children and a laugh like jingled keys, began dropping off odd jobs they thought our hands could manage. Someone else offered to mend the roof after a windstorm. A school teacher we had seen at the church one Sunday brought Sam a picture book with animals that looked like they'd been sketched by someone who loved things without asking too many questions. She read to him in the afternoons while I hung laundry and listened from where I stood. There were, of course, setbacks. Old shadows return when they're well fed. One week, the city we lived near decided to increase the cost of coal, and the news made the milkman whisper in the lane. Another time, a son of a family who had been good to us fell ill, and the town pooled its prayers and potions until there was little left but hope and the slow orbit of care. Yet even in hardship, the rhythm held because more hands were learning to pass the light. Sam, for his part, seemed to grow both more fragile and more daring at once. He learned to walk the length of the lane by himself, paper bird in pocket, and return with pockets full of small charms. A button like a tiny moon, a pebble smoothed into a smile, a scrap of cloth that smelled of lavender. He traded these for bits of kindness, as if the world were a market of consolation. Once he bargained with a beekeeping neighbor for a single spoon of thick honey and accepted it in a paper cup with the ceremony of someone receiving a crown. The promise flower continued to bloom in cycles. Sometimes it drooped from having given so much. Then it would recover, small and stubborn. Sam learned the names of its leaves and would tell anyone who would listen that the white was made of courage and the stem of patience. He practiced the word patient until it felt less like a moral instruction and more like a thing one could do with hands. One evening, as winter made a slow approach and the light thinned to a careful silver, Lucas asked if we could make a lantern. It was the sort of sudden, small ambition that comes in households where people are trying to teach their lives to be useful. We had scraps of glass, an old jar with a lid, and the remains of a candle, whose flame had been reliable through many small storms. Together we set to work, and Sam was solemn as an apprentice, tying wire and placing glass with the deliberation of someone arranging keepsakes. The light inside the jar trembled but did not go out. We placed it on the table between us like an object of ceremony, and, for a while, spoke only of simple things. The way the kettle rattled, the hush of the street, the fact that the world could still be held in a small glass if you were careful. It became our practice then, on some nights, to take the lantern down the lane and stop at every house that had once shown us kindness. We did not announce ourselves with fanfare. The lane was not used to parades. We knocked, muted and polite, and left the lantern at the threshold as a way to say, without too many words, that someone wished them light. Sometimes the person who opened the door would meet Sam with a softness in their face that made him grin. Other times they would weep. The lantern was a simple thing, but it carried permission to be fragile in front of another. Each morning we would find notes taped to our gate. Thank you, keep it, forgive.
little mirrors of the cloaked woman's practice. It was during one of these walks that Clara returned. She did not come with a flourish. No procession announced her. She came to the lane on an afternoon that smelled of rain and onions. The market was near and someone had burned liver on a stall. And she walked toward our gate with the slow, obedient step she had when she first left. Her hair had grown a little thin at the crown, and there were lines cut into her face that had not been there before. She wore the same practical coat, patched at the elbow, and carried a small satchel that had seen better days. When she saw us in the doorway, she stopped as if she had not known we would be there, and then, as if correcting herself, stepped forward. Sam ran to meet her and launched himself into her legs like a vine. He pressed his face into her coat and held on as if she were a rope he had been taught to trust. Clara knelt and hugged him, slow and careful, and when she looked up at me, there was a kind of apology in the way her eyes were soft. She had returned not with explanations, but with more of herself. She seemed less like a visitor who had been away and more like a traveler who had finally decided a map could have a home. "I thought the road was long," she said, voice small. "It taught me patience." There was in her manner a new economy. She spoke less about where she had been and more about what she had learned. She had worked in other rooms, they were her words. Small hospital rooms, a boarding house where people traded beds for stories, a kitchen where strangers were made family by the common need to eat. She did not ask to come back and settle like someone putting a claim on a parcel of earth. She asked only for a place to rest for a while. She wanted nothing but the right to be near the people she had left. Nain, who arrived soon after with a basket of repaired fabrics, did the sort of thing he always did. He made room. "We can make tea," he said, as if the solution to every trial had always been and would always be a kettle. Lucas set about making a small shelf for Clara's satchel, as if to prove that practicality is a measure of home. The garden accepted her as if it too recognized a familiarity in the way she moved among plants. She knelt by the promise flower and stroked its petals like one might a brow. That night we lit the lantern and set it in the window. The flame threw shadows against the wall and made long, soft silhouettes of our faces.
Clara sat at the table and took out from her satchel a small bundle wrapped in cloth, a book bound by hand and filled with pages of recipes and little remedies, inked in a tidy, spare hand. She told us it was what she carried when she felt the urge to be useful. Inside were notes on how to make a poultice, a diagram of knots for tying bandages, a recipe for lemon biscuits that could be made without sugar when there was none to be had. Each page had the kind of care that suggested the holder had collected life into a form so it could be given away again. She did not stay long. She said that she needed to travel on, that there were rooms that needed her hands to make them less raw. But her visits became a ritual for a while. She would arrive with a bundle, stay long enough to perform some small mending, and teach us a patience we could wear like a coat. Before she left, she slipped into my hand a paper folded so many times that it looked like a small, weary insect. Inside was a seed like the one I had found that first morning, tiny, black, lovely, and absurd. Clara smiled at Sam and said simply, "Plant it. Tell it stories when you can." We planted the seed beneath the eaves beside the other bloom. It did not sprout at once. Things of value rarely do. Sam watered it with the ceremonial seriousness of someone entrusted with treasure. He told it about the lantern and about the song he sometimes thought he heard at the gate. He told it about the letter and the bird and the neighbor who kept bees. When frost came heavy and trimmed the edges of the world with white teeth, he would cover the soil with an old scarf and murmur promises into it like an incantation. There was a time when we feared that the pattern would break again, that under any small strain the world might fall away and leave us with the memory of light only. Instead, under the pressure of small, steady acts, the pattern altered its shape.
The town began to find ways to be less alone. The woman who owned the bakery started teaching a weekly class on bread making in the back room, charging only what people could afford and taking, sometimes, work in trade. The school teacher organized a song circle where people came with instruments that were old or broken and left with new tunes in their mouths. Lucas and Nyan joined a group that helped repair the roofs of elderly houses, forming a line of hands that could bear weight. Sam's paper birds multiplied. He left them on stoops, placed them in drawers, took them to market to show the children who did not yet know him. Each bird carried a small scrap of paper tucked inside with a message: laugh, stay, remember, forgive. People found them and kept them like little talismans. Sometimes they would come to our door to tell us how these paper beings had moved them, how finding one inside the bread box had made them cry in a way that mended something they had forgotten how to name.
There were nights when I thought the work of keeping a flame was too much for me. I would lie awake and listen to Sam breathe and think of how few people had the skill to stay. But the lane had learned. Goodness is a habit as much as anything else, and habits, once practiced, grow like vines. On a morning that smelled of river fog and the first brave bulbs of spring, Sam ran to the window and shouted a word that made me stand faster than I had intended. The seed had risen. It pushed through the soil like a thought becoming a plan. Its first leaf opened like a hand uncurling. Sam pressed his forehead to the glass and laughed, a laugh that started as a whisper and became a bell. He called out to the lane, and neighbors answered with their own small noises. Dogs barking, shutters being opened, a woman calling, "That's lovely!" I knelt beside him and felt the solidness of him against my side. "It remembers," he said. "Yes," I replied, "we taught it well." Outside, the light was coming slow and honest, not the sudden affront it had been in earlier years, but the careful illumination of something learning to be kind consistently. The lantern in the window caught that light and made it warm. Clara's visits continued like footnotes, brief, incandescent, but the town no longer looked to her as its sole savior. She had begun, consciously or not, a teaching that could be passed hand to hand, that survival is a communal craft, learned by watching and then doing. There would be other trials, of course. Life keeps a ledger, and those ledgers are often unkind. But the web we had started to weave was strong enough to hold a child who sneezed and laughed at the same time, strong enough to keep a promise bloom alive through frost, strong enough to cradle a lantern in the window for anyone who might be keeping vigil. One night, when the moon was a careful coin in the sky, there was a knock at the gate. Sam's hands were busy folding a new paper bird, his tongue peeking out at the corner of his mouth in concentration. He went to answer it with the patience of someone who had practiced being surprised without panic. I followed, slower, feeling the weather of the house inside my ribs. At the gate stood a person I did not know, a stranger with exhausted eyes and a bag slung across one shoulder. He looked like someone who had been walking for reasons that had nothing to do with convenience. "May I come in?" he asked, as if asking permission would make the world kinder. Sam stepped aside and held the gate with both hands, as if it were a little harbor. "We have a lantern," he announced. "We share lights." The stranger smiled, small and astonished, like a man granted a map. He handed me a paper, folded thin and careful. It was a list of towns, names, a scrawl about places he had been, and tucked into it a single sentence: "I was told there is a house where laughter is kept." He looked at Sam, and in that look there was recognition, the recognition of someone who had once also been taught to hold light. We opened the gate wider. The lantern in the window flared as if to approve the enlargement of our circle. We made room at the table, and I poured tea as hands learned the habit of hospitality.
Clara sat beside the stranger, and in a voice that had mapped out many rooms, she asked him where he had come from. He spoke in modest bursts about the road and the weather and the small, inexplicable mercy that had led him to our lane. It is a strange and lovely thing to find one's life suddenly a harbor for those who too had been shipwrecked by misfortune. We had taught ourselves to be that harbor, not grand, not perfect, but capable of holding tired bodies and teaching them to breathe again. We did not believe in miraculous erasers. We believed in paper birds and lanterns and shared bread, that these would suffice when paired with the stubborn dignity of people deciding to be kind. That night, when the stranger had gone to bed and the lantern had burned down to a sweet-smelling stub, I sat at the table and wrote a small note. I did not send it anywhere. I folded it and placed it in Clara's box, a new scrap in a place that seemed made for things we could retrieve when we were unsure. On it, I wrote only, "We pass the light." Sam came to the table and set a paper bird on my hand. He looked at me with the sober pride of someone who thinks he has done something necessary. "We pass it," he said. Outside, a wind passed through the lane and lifted the loose leaves from the gutter. Somewhere a dog barked and then was quiet. The world, busy with its own indifferent appetite, continued to turn. We kept our small ceremony and learned one more time how to be enough for one another. The promise flower bent toward the window. The new seed, still timid, had shown the courage to wake. The lantern had been passed. Hands, joined, carried more than they had thought they could. And so we passed it, again and again, because there was nothing else if not this, the habit of giving, receiving, and letting light move from house to house until it changed the corridor of our days into something that might be called, not by any grand name, but by a truer one, home.